Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's an extreme honor. Those of you who haven't heard me speak before, I'm from Oklahoma City. I was born and raised here. Went to Putnam City North High School. I live in Austin, Texas, which I know is kind of an evil sort of betrayal of Oklahoma. But it's always great to come back to my home city, and it's fun to see the city continue to grow. I say this every time I'm here. It's amazing to me how vibrant this community is now that we can have conferences and meetups and so many people passionate about this stuff. One of the reasons, for better or worse, that I left for Austin was back in the olden days when I was in school, there wasn't so much of this, and I moved to find work. But it's nice to see Oklahoma being so on track. So I appreciate you guys being here. I'm known as Getify online, so if you're into that whole online stalking thing, you can find out about me, all the places there. This is kind of a new talk for me. You guys are getting this for the first time. And I'm known a bit for sort of being a bit controversial or kind of, outside of the mainstream. This talk will not disappoint if you've come to expect that of me. I'm going to suggest some rather heretical things through the course of this talk. But we're going to take kind of a winding path through this particular, let's fix something real quick. We're going to take a winding path through today's discussion. And we're going to talk about, we're going to meander our way through a whole bunch of different things that may seem a bit unrelated. But I hope that by the end, you'll kind of see the method to my madness. So just stick with me as we kind of go through. And this talk at the beginning is not going to feel very technical. It's not going to feel like it has anything to do at all with JavaScript or the programming. And you guys are at a high-tech conference, so I'm sure that's what you're expecting. I promise we'll get there. I promise we'll take a path, but we'll eventually get there. So we're going to start by talking about drive-thrus, which is that time-honored tradition that we have of the kids in the car in the back seat, and they're screaming their heads off, and parents pull up to the drive-thru, and it's this impossibly long line, and you pull up to the window, and you are finally ready to get your food, and you participate in this sort of heated negotiation with the person at the window, whereby the goal is to exchange pennies for calories in the highest possible ratio that you can, and to get this done as quickly as possible. And we've come to expect that these have become the pinnacle of optimization in our lives. And it's interesting to me how, and I drive through from time to time, but it's interesting to me how we can spend enormous amounts of time waiting on certain areas of our life, but when we show up to the fast food drive-thru, any second that we have to wait extra long, any extra delay in that process is an intolerable offense to our senses. We feel like it must be fast, and if this guy takes an extra 10 seconds with my fries, that is unacceptable, and we certainly will let them know that. Now, drive-thrus are not a new phenomenon. They've been with us. It's one of the oldest professions in the world. They've been with us since the beginning. And before we had rubber on our tires, we were pulling up to the drive-thru and expecting to get our Big Macs and our fries as quickly as possible. And luckily, drive-thru technology and it being part of our culture, drive-thrus have stayed with us through the years. As we begin to evolve our modes of transportation, the drive-thru continued to evolve with us, and it continued to make sure that there was a never-ending stream of impossibly small condiment packets and impossibly hot coffee. We got to move through time with drive-thrus, and I could say something about this slide, but it sort of speaks for itself. Whether you're rich or poor, fancy or not, douchey or down to earth, the drive-thru demurs to our benefit. Now, I don't know this lady's name, but she looks very nice. If you can see that she's got a smile on, has a very welcoming and friendly appeal, and she looks like a Sheila to me. So for the purposes of our discussion today, I'm going to call her Sheila, and we're going to see her a couple of times. I'm going to call her Sheila. Now, her name badge, if I could see it, would have a fake name anyway, so it's okay for me to make up a name for Sheila. So today we're going to talk about Sheila. And Sheila is who greets me when I pull up to the drive-thru. And of course, I'm expecting to receive my drink and my food in the most optimal way. But after having waited for way too long to give my order and not even being able to understand the person on the other end of the little microphone thing, and paying more than I ought to be paying for food that's way less quality than I ought to be getting, at least I show up to the window and have someone with a smiling, happy face. And I know for just that short moment that this isn't a finely tuned machine designed to get me through as quickly as possible. There's a human that's ready to hand me my food, and that makes me feel good. Of course, we know that's not the typical experience that we have in drive-thrus. But at least Sheila, she has a friendly, welcoming demeanor. Now, I want you to look closely at this picture and see if you can find what's strange here. And I don't mean that we have this gigantic gallon-sized cup being handed to me. That's not the strange part. But I want you to see if there's something missing here. What's missing from this particular picture? As I'm greeted at the drive-thru, what's missing? And let me give you a hint. What's missing from this particular picture? Because I'm being handed this giant-sized drink, and I'm in my tiny little car, and I got people all around, and people are honking at me to hurry up, and I'm thirsty, and I can't take advantage of this drink because I'm wondering, where is my straw? I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've had this experience many times where I pull up to the drive-thru and I've ordered both food and a drink, and they hand me the drink first, but they do not hand me a straw. And instead, 30 seconds, 2 minutes, if you're at Whataburger, it's about 20 minutes later, they will hand you your food. Sorry to pick on Whataburger. They'll hand you your food, and inside the bag is your straw. And so you're sitting there wondering, why can't I drink my drink when they've handed it to me? This is an interesting story about why that's happening. And I actually began to investigate, why do they do that? Is this just sort of a random thing? Why do they do that? I'm not going to give you the punchline yet. We're going to come back to Sheila later in the talk. But we need to take a step back and understand sort of where my mindset was when I began to explore this. So we're going to take a step back, and we're going to take sort of a virtual trip that was an actual trip that I took. It was an honor to get to go and speak at a conference in Aruba earlier this year. And, you know, they really had to twist my arm to convince me to go speak in Aruba. But for those of you who don't know where Aruba is, I thought I'd pull up a helpful map, because as I've heard, U.S. Americans don't have maps. So I want to make sure it's clear. We're down here off the coast of South America, and that's where Aruba is. Now, I said that there was a conference there, so of course it's some work that's involved. But I also wanted to take the opportunity to take my family along with me. So it was a family vacation that we took. I packed up my wife, who was 8.5 months pregnant. We got the okay from the doctor that it was still okay for her to get on the plane and go to the beach. But I took my wife, who was pregnant with our second child, our daughter, and we took our 2-year-old son, and we went to Aruba. We spent over a week there, and it was beautiful, and it was amazing. And I'm not just doing that to make you guys feel bad because you're in cold, windy Oklahoma. There's a reason why I'm talking about Aruba. But we went to Aruba, and the best part of Aruba is that while my family was out on the beach experiencing these amazing scenes, I was sitting inside of a conference center listening to conference talks, which is exactly what you ought to do. You ought to get on a plane and fly 800 miles just so you can not experience the beach. But I was at this conference, and I was sort of being forced into, out of my comfort zone, forced into thinking about things that I hadn't thought about before. Some amazing speakers, a very small sort of intimate gathering. And fortunately, we had some off time, so I did get opportunities to spend some time on the beach. And it was while spending time with my family, particularly with my son, that I began to notice some things and learn some lessons from the beach. And in fact, this particular set of lessons that I learned from the beach in Aruba turned out to be transformative to the way I think about my career, the way I think about our industry. In many senses, it is the impetus behind today's talk. Even though this was, months and months ago, these things have been stirring around in my brain ever since, and I have the courage finally to sort of act upon some of these strange and bizarre lessons that I began to learn from the beach in Aruba. So I wanted to share a few of those with you as we talk today. The first lesson is that I began to understand something about my own perceptions. I fancy myself to be a pretty decent engineer, and I suspect many of you in the room that are programmers, you feel pretty good about your skills. And so I feel like I'm a good design, engineering design, and I can understand processes. I understand that when the waves come up, there needs to be something to protect the castle from the waves. So I dig the trench and build the little protecting wall. As I'm building my sandcastle, I begin to fancy myself as an engineer, and I begin to think in my mind that the sort of thing that I'm creating is like the picture you see here. In my mind, I begin to think that my sandcastle is an amazing work of art. And so I'm working on, protecting my sandcastle and making sure that I have all the right tools in place and all of that. And I began to realize that that's not unlike my career. My career, I believe, the code that I write, the code that I work on so hard, the code that I put out in the open source community and things like that, I believe that that code is a work of art. And I believe that that code represents my talent and my skill, and it represents something useful to the world. So I began to see that this is my perception, not only of my sandcastle making skills, but also of my development skills. But in reality, the first lesson that I learned is that I do need to actually have a better sense of humility. Not only about my sandcastle making, because this is actually probably even better than my own sandcastles, but also about my career. Because there are millions upon millions of talented developers, most of whom are more talented than I am. Most of whom have put out more impactful code than I will ever write. Most of whom are at bigger conferences and they write more books and they have a wider impact on the community than I will ever have. And even though in my own mind I can think about the sandcastle in the previous slide and I can think that is my impact on the world, in reality my impact on the world is probably a lot more like this, to be realistic. And a healthy dose of humility every once in a while is not a bad thing. So I began to realize I need to look at things a bit differently. I need to look at things with perhaps the eyes of those around me, perhaps the eyes of all the talent that's around me, rather than thinking that I, through some ego, that I have something special that I'm giving to the world. In addition to that, while building the sandcastle, I began to notice something. I'm on the beach with my son, and of course, as an engineer, I'm trying to work things together, and the best of my results ends up like this. But I began to notice that my son took a very different approach. My 2-year-old son, Ethan, took a very different approach to sandcastle making. And it frustrated me to no end that I couldn't sort of get him to be like the engineer like I was being. I was trying to, dig the ditch and build the wall and stuff like that, and then we'd get some protection, and I'd start to help him build up the towers of his sandcastle, and he would playfully just knock it all down. And then we'd gather some more sand mounds together, and then he would throw his toy car at it, and it would knock it down again. And at first, this was frustrating to me. To watch my son he didn't get it, right? The goal here is to build a sandcastle. That is our objective. And we have steps and processes and tools in place for us to get to our objective. And my son did not share the same objective. And at first this was frustrating to me until I realized that maybe his was the better part. Because for my son, the experience was the objective. It was not the end result, it was the experience. He had no concept of what a perfect sandcastle looked like, but what he had a concept of is, this is fun to knock down the sand. And so in the moment, as I was working and engineering and trying to build something up that really didn't even amount to something great anyway, I began to realize that I was sort of missing out on the experience of the moment, focusing too much on the overall impact that I might have on the world, and it began to reinforce that concept of humility. It also began to reinforce, as we saw, no matter how well I tried to engineer protections from the water, we began to see that there were natural processes in place that, as you all know, began to wash the sandcastle efforts away. My sandcastle, right next to my son's sandcastle, the water didn't discriminate. It wasn't that somehow, some way I had built a better sandcastle than him. Ours both got washed away when the high tide came up. And so, as I started to realize there's something important about that perspective with respect to the work that we do as engineers. We might need to take a step back and realize that the stuff that we build is not quite so permanent. Now, I've taken a little screenshot down here. This is from GitHub. This is my most substantial, what would be seen as my most impactful project that I have ever written. It's lab.js, and I believe that this is now an effective logo for the project because as time goes on, the most effective things that we ever come up with still begin to wash away. As a side note, by the way, I have, it's Getify's theorem number 417, that once you get to 1,000 stars on GitHub, and I'm so close, once you get to 1,000 stars on GitHub, you get to have a dedicated meetup for your project, and once you get to 1,500 stars, you get to have a dedicated conference. So come on, baby, let's get some more stars. I'm looking forward to Lab.js Conf 2015. But things wash away. Maybe things aren't so permanent, and as the arc of time goes on, in fact, there probably won't be much left. I would hazard a guess that maybe 10 years from now, nobody will know a single line of code that I've written. And that used to bother me. It used to bother me that the efforts and work that I'm putting into all of this and all the conference speaking and all the books and all the workshops that I teach, all of those things, it used to bother me that those things might not make a lasting impact. Because again, I needed that dose of humility that says there will always be somebody smarter coming along and doing it better. I don't have to look at my career as a collection of how well did I do, how much did I impact, how permanent was the code that I wrote. I mean, in a sense, yeah, the code's up on, it's open source and it's been archived. In a sense, it's going to last, but it's not going to matter. Nobody's going to be going and looking back at those lines of code 10 years from now. We're not even going to be working with the same languages by then. So these are some of the lessons that I was learning, and it turns out I wasn't done. There was another lesson for me to learn. First, it was humility. Then it was the temporary nature of the things that we do. Now, this particular picture is really terrible quality, and I got to apologize for that. We just got to blame my Android phone because we know how great their cameras are. Just really terrible quality, and certainly I'm a good photographer. I made sure to include my son's foot in the photo. What this is trying to depict is a little cove area with water, and if you were able to see in all the fullness of beauty that I could see with my own eyes at the time, you would see a swarm of thousands of multicolored fish here, and we're feeding the fish by throwing out little bits of bread. And just like in the drive-thru, as soon as we throw out a piece of bread, they rush to get that food as quickly as possible, and then they go on about their way, or they wait in line again for more food. So let's use our imagination, because this is a terrible picture, and I'm not going to be able to make my point with a terrible picture. So thanks to Google Images, let's use our imagination. Let's pretend that this is what I was actually seeing. Thousands upon thousands of fish scurrying in this little cove, trying to grab the little pieces of bread that we might throw out. And it was during one of these morning sessions feeding the fish that I learned my next lesson from the beach of Aruba. And the lesson that I learned came from the idea that when I would throw a piece of bread out, and you can imagine this is me standing at the viewpoint of this camera, if I threw a piece of bread out to this area, but there was an incredibly talented, maybe even the biggest fish of the whole group down here in this part, if the bread lands in this area, no matter how good, no matter how talented, no matter how big, no matter how dominant, no matter how skilled that fish is down in the bottom left, he has no chance of arriving at that bread. And I began to learn that there's a piece of fortune, a piece of luck. There's a whole bunch of different words that you can use for it, and I don't want to get into the philosophical, but let's just call it fortune. There's a piece of fortune involved in everything that we do. There's a component of that involved in everything that we do. You happen to be in the right place at the right time. No matter how good or how skilled I am as a developer, if I'm not in the right position, I don't write CoffeeScript like Jeremy Ashkenaz does and change the landscape of development. No matter how skilled I am not fully in control of my own fate, if you will, to sort of pseudo-philosophical it. So I began to realize that as a fish swimming amongst this, I can only do my best. And I can only accept that that might get me so far. And I got to wait around until the bread lands. I can't necessarily guarantee that I'll always be able to get the piece of bread. So there's a portion of this that I have to leave to fortune. These were not just surface lessons for me. These began to deep seat themselves in my psyche, and it began to affect all areas of my life, not just my career. I began to look at things through the eyes of more humility. I began to look at through things with the eyes of more temporality. And I began to look at things with the eyes of more fortune involved in the things that I do. And this has changed some of the way that I approach my career. And as I said, it begins to inform what I want to talk about today. Through these deep thoughts, I began to ask some interesting questions. The first question that I asked is, I'm sure you're aware of that phrase, no man is an island, right? It speaks to the idea that we are all interconnected and the things that you do affect the things that this person does. I began to ask the counter of that question. Am I an island? I am an island? Maybe. Maybe the things that I do aren't going to affect you. Maybe you're never going to run across a piece of code that I ever write. And maybe it's better for me to realize that the things that I work on work in my sphere, and you have your own sphere, and that's totally okay. Maybe I don't have to take such a huge, wide, sort of global perspective to everything I do and try to water things down to sort of meet the masses. Maybe it's okay for things to work just for me. And I began to even extend that line of question. Maybe what's best for me is best only for me. You see, we take approaches to optimization at the macro level. We say we optimize and we standardize, we optimize for what everybody can agree upon. But if we take the logical conclusion of this line of thinking about temporality and fortune and humility, we might start to realize, you know what, the things that I do, I might be the only person on the planet that thinks that way. I might be the only guy weird enough to think about it in that particular fashion. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's actually what's best for me. So the next thing I began to do after this experience in RIM is I began to observe where the world's constraints on me are. I know that sounds very sort of new agey and hippie and sort of egotistical, but I began to observe the places in life where decisions made on the macro level maybe didn't fit quite so much with decisions that I would have made more at the micro level. So I want to walk you through some observations that I have made along these lines, some observations about things that are in this world. I saw this image on Twitter a few months ago, and I did a little bit of research at the time. I don't remember all the exact details, but if you can't see, what we have here is sort of a raised platform at the corner, and then we have an accessibility ramp that's supposed to be used for people that have accessibility needs. Right in the middle of the ramp, we have these giant poles that are still sticking out. Quite obviously, the poles were not removed when the rest of this was built. As a matter of fact, I began to do some research about this at some city over in Europe that I don't know the details of, but there was one jurisdiction which handled the making of the sidewalk and the ramps, and there was a different jurisdiction that handled the light poles. And so when the city decided to renovate this area and build the ramps and stuff, they negotiated, but what they negotiated was, our contract says we're going to build the ramp, but our contract does not say we're going to remove the poles. And in fact, we're not allowed to because that's not our jurisdiction. So somebody else is going to have to come along and remove the poles, and when they do, the rest of the ramp can be completed. So they faithfully did their work, using the processes and the tools that are optimized for their normal standards of business. And they allowed the jurisdictions to work. 2 years on, the jurisdiction that handles these light poles still had not come and completed their job. Now, in the micro sense, the guys that built this ramp did their job. But in the global sense, in the holistic sense, did they do their job? We found an optimization that allowed them to complete the work without waiting for the poles to be removed. But in the overall sense of what was given to the public, is this accessible at all? In fact, no, it's laughable. You see, part of the problem that we get into is when we optimize in sort of this myopic mindset, we forget the holistic experience. And we can arrive at totally wrong conclusions. Here's another one. This is actually not the first time I've been able to put this in slides. I love this picture, so I'm happy to have been able to put this up for a second time. Sorry to be indelicate for those of you in the crowd that maybe don't love bathroom humor, but somehow I don't have a great historical explanation for this. This is not made up. I don't have a great historical explanation for this particular scenario like I did for the city, but I'm going to posit that somehow, some way, there was a system of processes in place that this made sense in the micro. Perhaps it was the plumbers. There was one plumbers union that built this wall, and there was a different plumbers union that built this wall, and the way they put those pipes together, this was the way that did it. Or maybe there was some regulations in place that required them to have a certain capacity to their bathroom, and for space concerns, they said, well, we'll fulfill the requirements of capacity, even though in reality, no two people would use this at the same time. No two people in their right mind anyway. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a great explanation for it, but I can say to you this is an example of that misoptimization is what I'll call it for now. And even if we were to go through these examples and try to find historical explanations, the question that still remains is, how is this possible? How is this possible that in our real everyday lives, we get so focused on the small and we forget the big? How is that possible? Well, let me offer a suggestion for how that's possible. Now, I took some math in school, but I'm not going to give you calculus formulas or anything like that. We're just going to pretend that there's some system that is modeled by this particular graph. And by system, I mean a set of inputs and constraints and things like that. I don't know what they are, but we're making things up as we go. So this is a system of inputs and constraints, and it results in these particular values. Now, there's a concept that we would call from the mathematical world or from the graphing world, we call this the global maxima. We can say if we see the entirety of the system, we know that A is the global maxima. So how is it that in so many cases we arrive at what is not a global maxima? In fact, we myopically focus on one part of the curve, and we arrive at A prime, and we call that a local maximum. How does that happen? Well, it happens first because we don't take the entire system into account. We myopically focus on one small part, and instead of looking at the bigger picture. So what I'm essentially going for here is that I think a lot of things, a lot of processes, not only in our everyday lives, but I think also in our development careers, a lot of these processes begin to be local maximums. They are certainly optimized. They did the job and they found the local maximum, but they didn't do the bigger job. They didn't look at the bigger picture. They left the light pole in place. Let me give you some other observations from real life where I see this sort of thing happening. This is an old school radio from the 40s or 50s. Now you'll notice on this particular design for this radio, it's pretty clear that these are channel presets. It's pretty clear that one of these is probably the tuning and one of these is probably the volume, and that's the entirety of the user interface that needed to be designed for this particular radio. And for, I would say, probably the majority of use cases, that user interface for that radio is totally fine. However, there are some use cases that are left out. Even as we go to the more modern of the radios, and we have lots and lots of extra buttons and lots of on-screen displays. In fact, even when you go to the luxury where now it's not a physical thing anymore and it's entirely driven by software, you would think that we would now be capable of servicing every single use case there is because we essentially have an infinite amount of buttons to create now that we have a digital screen. I don't know how many of you have displays like this in your car or have the other sorts of radios that I showed. I would love it if one of you has one of those old-timey radios. I'd actually love to see that in person. But one thing that seems a little bizarre to me is that I have never seen a radio with a mute button. Why is there no mute button? Even if you were to go through all the deep recesses of these menus, you're going to come up with all kinds of equalizers where you can balance it and turn the sound from the left back quadrant to the front right quadrant or any of that other junk. But the simplest of all functions, you don't have a mute button. Now I was searching around to see if there was some sort of clever reason why radios don't have mute buttons. And I found a forum where somebody had asked, you can't read this text, I'll read it to you. But I found a forum where somebody literally asked, why doesn't my radio have a mute button? And this particular answer sort of sums it up. The radio shuts down and restarts almost instantly. That's as good as a mute button to me. Actually, none of my previous cars had dedicated mute buttons. So you know this instinctually. We don't need a mute button because I can just turn on and off the radio. If I receive a phone call while I'm listening to my tunes, I just hit the power button and turn off the radio. Now, for the majority of use cases, that probably works just fine. But there are some use cases where that's not optimal. For instance, consider not just a radio, but consider the overall sound system, the overall entertainment system that you have installed in your dash. You probably have built-in navigation. So let's say that you're trying to navigate your way around some tricky area that you don't know, and it's reading you off directions and showing you directions, and you get a phone call. At that particular moment, what you're interested in is muting the sound, but not turning off the system. Because if you turn off the system, now you don't have your navigation showing you. And with no mute button, what are you left to do? Really, really fast, you turn the dial to turn down the volume, or you press the button on your steering wheel to turn down the volume. Now, I know that's a silly example, but it's one of those cases where somebody said back in the day, whoever needs a mute button? We've got a power button. And they arrived at what I would call a local maxima. They arrived at a design for a user interface that now is an established precedent for radio and entertainment system design. We would consider that ridiculous, by the way, in our home entertainment centers. If you got a remote control with your entertainment center and it had no mute button on it, you'd take it back, right? But somehow we arrived at the idea that that's okay with our car systems. We arrived at a local maxima. Here's another one, by the way. This is one of my favorite examples, and this isn't original to me. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference, real-time conference up in Portland, and a guy named Aral Balkan. He's a fantastic guy. If you don't follow him, you totally should. This is a video of his talk, and his talk, by the way, is sort of along similar lines to what I'm talking about. It's sort of this holistic design, experience design-driven development. And what he brings up is this example. This is a sign from a train, and this was in the UK. This is a sign from a train, and he posited that he was on this train and everything was fine until he tried to get off of the train and he couldn't figure out how to get out of the train. But they had this helpful sign posted next to it. So let me explain what's happening. You first have to wait for the automatic locks to disengage after the train stops. Then you have to lower the window and reach outside of the window to open the handle and let yourself out of the train. Now, that seems ridiculous to us. It seems absolutely ridiculous to us that they would design an interface in this particular way. But let's examine the actual historical way that we arrived at that. Back in the olden days when this train was first built, there was no such thing as automatic locks. In fact, there were no locks at all. It was simply a door with a handle. And back then, if you're traveling on a train, it's going 60 miles or 80 miles an hour or something like that. If you were to accidentally bump that doorknob from the inside and the door were to simply open up with no locks, you'd probably be having a bad day at that point. So they designed a system at the time that made an awful lot of sense. Put the handle on the outside, make it difficult, make it that you have to intentionally decide to open the door so that you're not going to accidentally fall out at 80 miles an hour. Or kilometers an hour since we're in Europe. But then, at some point, somebody came along and installed locks on the train. And guess what they didn't do? They didn't look at the entirety of the system. They said, well, we've got locks now, everything's great. And they didn't think about, maybe we got to move the handle to the inside now. I don't know, that might have been a good idea. You see, we arrive at these local maximums in a lot of places. And I know I'm wandering. I understand that. I know you're getting impatient. You want the payoff. So let me go back to Sheila. Everybody remember Sheila? It turns out, by the way, that behind that smile, Sheila's thinking, hurry up and drive away. No matter how much I might like to believe that this is a human that wants to have human interaction with me, this is still a system that's highly optimized. So back to that question that I asked at the beginning. What about that process that's in place at nearly all drive-thrus and nearly all fast food restaurants, that they hand you your drink and they don't hand a straw? One evening, after I think having ridden my bicycle or something like that, and I was kind of tired and hungry and certainly thirsty, I went up to Taco Bell. I know that's a sin to eat at Taco Bell, but I went up to Taco Bell, and it was kind of late at night. There was nobody else in the drive-thru. It was just me. Pull up to the window after having ordered my giant drink and my tacos and burrito and whatever. Pull up to the window. They hand me my drink. Now, normally, they would hand you the drink, and then immediately after it hands you your food. So the lag time there is not particularly long in terms of getting your straw and being able to get your drink. And yes, I understand I'm being the height of lazy by saying I can't take the top off and sip the drink. I get that. But damn it, I want a straw with my overpriced drink that I paid for. So she hands me my drink with no straw, and then immediately begins to close the door, close the little window, and walked away. Didn't hand me my food. And I thought, oh, she'll be right back. And it turns out I waited over 2 minutes for them to come back and hand me my food, which is quite unusual for a fast food. They must have had to shockingly make something fresh for a moment. So she hands me my food, and of course there's my straw in it. And I don't know why, I was maybe just in sort of a cheeky mindset that night. But I said, can I speak with the manager? Sure enough, she went, and about a minute later, the manager came back, and I don't know what I was expecting, but I asked the manager, can you explain to me why it is that your process, it's not just an accident that this happened this way, your process is intentionally in place, that you hand out the drink without the straw, and then you hand the straw later. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know if I was expecting her to sort of make something up on the fly. But the answer that I got back was terribly profound. And it was another of the main motivations for why I wanted to give this talk. The manager responded to me, absolutely, we do that on purpose. And the reason we do that is because there have been studies that have shown that when we are trying to optimize the flow of the drive-thru, especially at heavy traffic times during lunch, what we've seen is if we hand a customer their drink and their straw all at once, we usually strive, especially at the busy times, we usually strive to be immediately ready to hand them their food also. We try to hand it all at once. And what we noticed is if we hand them the food if we hand them the drink cup with the straw, and then we're immediately ready to hand them the bag of food, most people, 9 out of 10 people or more, will not accept the bag of food and then will instead fiddle with opening up the straw wrapper or whatever. So they spend an extra 5 or 10 seconds opening up the straw wrapper, sticking it in, taking a good long gulp of their drink before they then turn their attention back to the drive-thru to accept their food. And in the interim, 10 or 15 valuable seconds have been wasted. When they were ready to get you, hurry up and drive away. They were ready to get you out of the drive-thru, but because of the order in which they gave you things, it resulted in less optimization. So they chose to optimize for the busy times and create a process, and they use that process globally, even when they're not on busy times. But they chose intentionally to give you the straw later because if they've already handed you all of your food and your drink, there's far less of a psychological reason for you to hold up the people behind you while you open up the straw. So that's the answer to the question, where's my straw? It's been optimized away. So what's the point of all this? What am I even talking about? Can I get to some real point? Standards is my point. Because we have lots and lots of standards. We have standards for processes, we have standards for languages, we have standards for presentation tiers, we have standards for operating systems, we have standards for platforms that we run our things on. Standards are everywhere. But standards can be, and this is sort of one of the punchlines of today's talk, standards can be a local maximum. I would say we need less standards, and in fact what we need really is better tools. We don't necessarily need to worry so much about agreeing upon everything. We simply need to have better tools to help us do our job better. Now, on the surface, you may nod, but when we dig into this, you may think I'm a little bit crazy, and that's okay. Let's dig into what I mean by that. What do I mean by less standards versus better tools? Let me have a religious war with you for just a moment. On this page, on one side is a space and on the other side is a tab. You're going to have to go download my slides at the end to figure out which one is which and which I prefer. But the religious war around spaces versus tabs. What's at the heart of this religious war around spaces versus tabs? Well, one of the major things that's at the heart of this is that we say everybody on the team needs to agree on spaces versus tabs because our code difference tools or code check-ins or Git or whatever, they're not particularly good at understanding that 4 spaces meant a tab, so they see those things differently. We need everybody to agree. But another part of this is that some group of your developers on your team grew up believing in spaces or grew up believing in tabs, and they have established that as the norm for your project. And they've said one reason, people argue, I want spaces because spaces can't change sizes depending on the device you're looking at the code in. So if I manually space things out with spaces, the code's going to look the same everywhere. Regardless of what editor you use, you're going to open it up and the indentation and all the spacing that I, code as art. All of that I went to all that trouble to do is going to look exactly the same. I consider that to be sort of a ridiculous argument, because in the same way that I as a developer decide to pick my own browser, and I use my own browser, and in fact I use more than one browser. I have one browser I use for browsing and one browser I use for development, and other browsers that I use when I don't want anything to be tracked with me. And I do those things on purpose. I have one browser that has Flash installed, and that's anytime I need Flash I use that browser. But the way I open up and view my code, why do you even care what it looks like when I open up and view the code? I understand why you care what code gets checked in. Let's set that aside for a minute. I understand why differences between code need to, but I don't understand why a team leader says, it looks this way on my screen, it needs to look exactly the same on your screen. It's my screen, it's my process, it's my tool, and it should be my optimization. Shouldn't I have the choice? And I'm not declaring a stance on spaces versus tabs. I'm just simply saying any argument that suggests that we need to standardize because everybody needs to experience it the same way is as ridiculous as saying that a website needs to look, feel, and behave exactly the same in Chrome 33 as it does in IE6. It's a ridiculous mindset. Things are intended to look and behave and feel differently, and people are allowed to make those choices. That's called democracy. Here's another religious war. Semicolons versus new lines. Yes, there is a new line character there in the slide. Now, there's some actual stylistic reasons why people pick semicolons. Some people think the semicolon is ugly at the end of the lines, but there's also some functional reasons why you make these decisions between semicolons and new lines. The famous thread, there was some library, I'm now forgetting the library, but I'm sure many of you know the famous thread where some library was using a trick with an exclamation mark instead of semicolons because they understood automatic semicolon insertion rules, they understood ASI, so they were taking advantage of their knowledge of that and they built their code without needing semicolons. And then somebody else took that library and tried to pass it through Douglas Crockford's JS lint. His JS lint tool complained and said, this is not valid. You need a semicolon here. And somebody filed a bug against that library and said, hey, your code's not passing Doug Crockford's linter. You need to correct that and add back in the semicolon in these places. And they responded back and said, well, that's a bug in Doug Crockford's linter because the ASI rules say it's completely valid, and for him to say it's not valid is a bug. And Doug Crockford got on the thread after being summoned from wherever he was in the ether. He got on that thread and he said, this is the stupidest piece of code I've ever seen. If you're writing code like that, you should expect for it to break. And what followed was a long religious war on that thread, hundreds of messages of people weighing in on both sides. And eventually, Doug Crockford acquiesced just a tiny amount. He added an option to his linter that he calls stupid mode. True story. You can turn on stupid mode if you want to allow this, what he thinks is stupid code. Let me ask you a question. Why do we have to care? Why can't we write tools that make that sort of debate completely moot and irrelevant? What if I want to write without semicolons, but I need to interop with systems that expect semicolons? Isn't that the job of tools? Why should a developer be focused on those sorts of things? And moreover, why should I be required to put semicolons in if I don't like them, or take them out if I do like them, just because you differ with my opinion? Why is that? What if your team didn't have to agree on such things? And there are a variety of other stylistic things that we could talk about where the semicolon goes on its own line or at the end of the line, where we all know it's supposed to go at the end of the line, right? So, I'm just kidding. those very stylistic questions that we sort of argue about, and we have teams that develop these elaborate style guides, and whenever somebody is newly onboarded to the team, we make sure that they read through the style guide, and we make sure that in code reviews they're adhering to the style guide. I had the first several commits that I tried to commit into the Firefox code base when I worked at Mozilla a few years ago. The first several commits, there were a couple of problems why my commits were rejected in code reviews, but the first couple of code reviews I went through, they were arguing with me about things like our standards or spaces versus tabs and stuff. And it still leaves me with that taste in my mouth, like, let's argue about the tangible stuff, and let's let better tools solve all of this ridiculous stuff that we don't need to worry about. In fact, I would posit that a majority, maybe not a majority, but certainly a plurality of the rules in your linter today are all things that the tool ought to just fix automatically. Instead of complaining back to you that you don't fit with some, agreed upon style guide, it ought to just fix it. If you write your curly braces on the new line and the style guide that's been agreed upon is that it goes at the end of the previous line, that's not difficult to fix. Why would we force it to give you an error back and create less optimal in your process for you to worry about such sorts of things? So I decided what we needed was a tool. And I'm working on this tool. You're going to go to this repo, and you're not going to see anything but a README, because I started working on this tool, and as I went down the rabbit trail, I realized there are a variety of other JavaScript tools that I need to work on helping improve before I can do what I want to do with this tool. But Esri is the name of this tool, and the goal of this tool is to allow you to create a set of standard stylized guide rules for all of these things that we're talking about, like whether semicolons are there, whether you have spaces between your parameters and your function calls, whether you're using spaces versus all that stuff you can define. And by the way, you define them as two-way isomorphic rule sets. So there's a standard rule set for what gets checked into the repo. And then there's a rule set that I personalize. So the standard rule set says spaces, and my style guide says tabs, and this tool takes care of the two-way transformation between those two. Why should I have to care? If the team decides that spaces are what they want to check into the GitHub repo, as long as when I check that code out, I run it through the tool and I make it sort of my view of the code, and then as long as it runs back through the tool the other way, everybody on the team can decide what styles work best for them. We don't have to agree that everybody has to do something exactly the same way. Standards in that case would be what I would call a local maximum. This goes beyond, by the way, style guides. Now, the inner joke here is that this picture comes from an old movie called 12 Angry Men. And this is sort of my hyperbole for what happens with the standards process of TC39. It's not really like this, obviously, but because they're not angry at all. But TC39, the committee that handles JavaScript, and they publish the versions of our JavaScript language, they have an enormously difficult task. Because as a committee, they have one of the most broad constituent bases of any language on the planet in terms of what they're being pulled in all these different directions. I don't know how many of you are following what's happening with ES6 and so forth, but ES6 and ES7 and even beyond, they have all these different constraints, and they're trying to serve people that want to write JavaScript, but also they're trying to serve people that want to write tools that compile to JavaScript. And those can sometimes be very different audiences with very different needs, and they're trying to create syntactic extensions. And for the most part, I would go on record as saying they're doing a pretty good bang-up job. There's some things that they're complete idiots about. They've made just total mistakes on, and that's okay. Those are just my opinions. But through the process of I've lurked on the list for a while. I've also in the past tried to participate in these discussion lists and sort of suggest things. And nearly without fail, when I have proposed something that I don't like about the language, or I don't like about the way that it's working, and I propose something, I get back one of two responses. Either you're doing it the wrong way, you're stupid, which means I need a stupid mode for my JavaScript, or the more common response that I get back when I try to propose something that we should change is, well, that won't work, and here's why. And there's some entirely other set of optimizations that they've chosen to say, we've optimized in this local maximum, and your use case doesn't fit inside of our window. And we've made these difficult decisions in these agreements. If you watched how the class keyword was debated among the JavaScript committee for several years, and they finally arrived at something. They arrived at this watered down version that probably is not going to please people on either side. And you have to be somewhere in the middle. You just have to accidentally be in the middle before you're going to like it. And that's just a reality of the process. I don't mean that to be a criticism. It's just a reality of the process. That it's really difficult to find that global maxima across all those people, across all those different constituents. So I want to pose this rather heretical question. What if you could customize JavaScript to your own liking? I don't just mean stylistically the code that is showing up in your editor, but I mean the actual semantics and syntax of the language. What if you could customize the language to your own liking? Now, we're going to talk in the last few minutes of this of my talk today, we're going to talk about, and here's where we finally start to get to some code. We're going to talk about some things that I think can help with this. So the first one I want to point out is a project that's not mine. It started as an independent project. It's now shepherded, supported by Mozilla. It's called Sweet.js. It's implementing what is expected to be the future version in, say, ES7 or ES8 of macros in the JavaScript language, first-class macros. Now, for those of you who haven't worked in a language with macros, essentially it says, let's take a scenario where you say, I don't like the word function. That's a bad word. Or I'm always misspelling it F-U-N-T-C-I-O-N, because I do that all the time. So I want for a macro to come along and give me a different word to use for the function keyword. It's essentially sort of a meta language or a meta logic on top of your code. It allows you to change nearly everything about the way the code works by simply layering on these various macros. Here's a complicated example, a little bit difficult to read because of the red color. Apologize about that. I'm not going to explain exactly the syntax of Sweet.js. If you want to go take a look, it's some really great stuff that they're doing. They've come up with some really incredible solutions. But this particular example, what they're doing, if it's a little bit hard to see, is they're taking a macro and they're defining a shortcut for when you have to do a test like x and ampersand x.y ampersand x.y.z. What you really want to do is you want to test for whether or not x.y.z exists, but because you can't do property access on undefined values, you have to first check the null case for each of the components. And the deeper it is, the more of those checks you do. They wrote a macro called nullity, where you can simply pass in as many of those as you want, and it does internally, it takes care of those checks for you. So you end up writing code like this instead of code like that. There's just one example of a way that a macro can come along, and you can decide the way I write my code. Now, it's true that these macros would be shared by the entire team. So it's not really personalizing it to your own personal taste. We'll get to that in a moment. This is really personalizing the JavaScript to something that your team could agree upon. But it would still allow you to write JavaScript in a way that works for you and your team, and it's not necessarily going to be the same that anybody else in the standards of the language are going to use. So we start to see some examples where we can customize things. Here's another example, block scoping. I'm a big fan of block scoping, but there's some problems with the way it's being introduced to our language. If you haven't heard, it's being introduced to our language with ES6. Here's the first example. Many of you, I'm sure, have written code like this. You've got an if block somewhere, and you put a var statement inside of it. Now, those of you that know about JavaScript, you know that there's this thing called hoisting. So var A is actually hoisted to the top of the function scope. So it's not actually there. But stylistically, you are giving a signal to the reader of this code if you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, the signal's, it's garbage in, garbage out. But if you know what you're doing, the signal you're giving is that this A variable belongs only to this block, and it should not be used outside of the block. That's the heart and soul of block scoping. Unfortunately, JavaScript up to this point has not supported that from a functional perspective. But from a stylistic perspective, you can choose to put them there. Now, some people do the opposite. They do all their own manual hoisting. They put all their vars at the top. I would argue that both code styles are perfectly valid. And in fact, you can probably mix the two. You can put stuff at the top if it's global to everything, and put stuff in blocks if it's only used for the block. All right, so the problem is that functionally this variable sort of leaks out. Now, the let keyword is being introduced in ES6. It hijacks whatever block it's found in, and it binds the variable to that block. So now A belongs to this block, not only stylistically, but also functionally. And when we try to reference it outside, we get an early error. An error that you've tried to reference a variable in a place that you don't like. So this is a big, huge improvement to the language. I'd highly recommend you start to think about your code using block scoping. but there are some problems. Let's take a look at a piece of code like this. I'm saying let one variable equal 1, and then I'm doing some other stuff, and let another variable and some other stuff, and then I'm using those variables in different scopes. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't usually write my code perfectly the first time. I usually have to refactor my code, and that usually involves taking arbitrary snippets like arbitrary if statements and moving them to a new location or wrapping them in another if block. When we're using var declarations, that just works because variables were automatically hoisted out. But when we start using block scoping, now there's some extra mental tax is what I call it, because you're going to have to think. You're going to have to be kind of careful here. Can I actually take that guy and move it? And which one of these declarations do I need to move? Or do I need to move them to another bigger level or something? You know, there's going to be some extra work there. You can't just do it the way you did it before. So one of the problems, I think, is that this particular syntax, the declaration syntax, lends itself to more of those problems because you can just strewn these things all about and it's a little bit harder. One thing that I prefer, you have to be careful, one thing that I prefer is another form of block scoping. It's called the let statement syntax or the let block syntax. It creates an explicit block as opposed to hijacking an existing one, creates an explicit block of scope, sort of like an iffy but not so bad. So we create an explicit one for let A and an explicit one for another. Now it's a little bit clearer where we can move things because these explicit blocks sort of jump off the page at us. The problem is that's not coming to ES6. They decided to add the let keyword in, the let declaration syntax, but not the let block syntax. That's kind of a bummer. As a matter of fact, I had some sort of existential moments for a while. I was like facepalming because I feel like that's far superior syntax. It's going to lead to more maintainable code, but they rejected it from the language. Then I realized we can fix that. We can write code like this, and we can make code like that work even though that's not part of the standards of the language. And I wrote a tool called letter. This tool goes through and takes your code, it finds stuff that looks like this, it finds let blocks, and it rewrites it to this ugly crap. But this works. And by the way, here's the side note, it works in ES3. You can use this today. You can use block scoping today, because it's a little known fact that the catch clause of a try-catch is block scoped. Now you wouldn't write code like this, that's terrible. But you wouldn't write the code that the CoffeeScript compiler spits out either. This is a tool to help you customize the language to give you better style, better format. And by the way, when you start wanting to target ES6, the same tool, instead of producing code like this, it produces code like this, which works in ES6. It creates a naked block and it uses a let declaration. So you can start using this today in ES3, and then when ES6 is fully, the only thing that you care about, like you're working in Node, you just add this extra flag onto the tool and it starts targeting ES6. Now you may think this is crazy. Turns out the tracer compiler, which is the official backwards compatible compiler that the standards committee is using to figure out ES6 features and back compile them to ES5, when you put in this code, guess what they produce? That's the official way the actual standards committee says to do it. And so they're optimizing the performance of this and all kinds of stuff. By the way, with respect to let and var declarations, this is the most common example when people talk about closure and things like that, problems with closure. This is kind of the canonical example because all of these functions are getting a closure of the same scopes that are all sharing I, and this doesn't print out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like we wanted it to. It instead prints out 6 over and over. The fix, which sucks, is to wrap some sort of iffy around it, right? And that's what I teach people. You wrap an iffy around it. Now you've got scope with a copy of variable that you can close over. Turns out the let keyword is a great solution. Using the let keyword here rebinds that I to each iteration of the loop. It's a special behavior. It rebinds it to each iteration, and it gives it the value that it had at the end of the previous iteration, so it works exactly like you'd expect, and these closures are now over each iteration. Each iteration gets its own scope to close over. So wait, what exactly am I suggesting? Am I suggesting basically democracy? Users can pick whatever they want. Am I suggesting anarchy, even oligarchy or heresy? Yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting pushback against what we've considered to be, let's all focus on one standard, let's all agree, and I'm saying, let's diverge. Let's optimize for ourselves. In other words, JavaScript, you can have it your way. You see, standards are a local maximum. And in fact, they lead us to miss the forest for the trees. that old adage. Because we're so focused on everybody being able to interop and agree, we miss the fact that an individual developer has a unique style, a unique way of thinking about things, and we need to optimize for that to get better performance out of the system rather than optimizing for standard agreement. Briefly, I know I'm getting the closing signals here. They want me to wrap up, but we got started late, so I'm okay with going over a few minutes. I decided to come up with a list of things that I have problems with in the language that need to be fixed, and let block scoping was one of them. But I made up this new language, and I did a write-up called FoilScript. I didn't build it yet, but I wrote up all these things on FoilScript about the things that are quirks or behaviors of JavaScript that I don't think should be there. Things like the nan. That's a terrible name for it because that's not what it really means. So let's rename it. Things like that. And I just want to briefly show you a couple of quick examples of things. This was going to be a whole other language, but now it's going to become a tool to help you customize your JavaScript. So one example is soft binding. When I have this keywords, and we all know that if you use a function in the wrong way, it's going to be broken because it doesn't have the proper this bindings. You have to do hard bindings. Problem is hard bindings can't be overridden, and that sucks. So what about soft bindings? Why don't we have that? And I propose this syntax where we, instead of using a dot, we use a hash operator. And what it does is creates a soft default to the object that you want it to be, but it can still be overridden if you want to. It's totally easy to add to the language. Why not add that and make our lives better? What about conditional catch clauses? This is something other languages have had. And by the way, this is something Firefox has had for well over a decade. They've had the ability to throw different sorts of errors, and not just the standard ones. You can create your own custom error classes, throw different sorts of error classes, and then catch conditionally based upon the type of the error. Totally easy to add, but we don't have that in the language yet. It's not even on a standards track. So we just add these little if statements in. That's easy to to transpile. Lastly, it's a small one, but it's a pain point for me, a lot of my code. I don't like the fact that the ternary requires me to put an else clause when that else clause might just be undefined. I do a lot of code where it's I want to assign the value or I want to leave it as undefined. So I hate putting colon undefined, and it turns out we can default. I've gone through the order of precedence of operators, and it turns out we can just assume a default there. Assume undefined. So this works exactly the way we'd expect, and awesome ends up as undefined. Or not cool ends up as undefined. So these optional ternary else's are something we can add, and there's a whole other list on FoilScript. But in other words, make your own JavaScript. And this is just a logical conclusion of a pattern that's already been happening. There's all kinds of languages. We had CoffeeScript, now we've got TypeScript. Just insert your own language, your own customizations. We're just taking it to the next conclusion that says if we can create variations on the language for everybody to agree on, we can create variations that only we agree on. Now you're going to ask the question, what about interop? And in the same way that I talked about isomorphic translations of styles, I'm working on, with FoilScript, creating a tool. It's going to be a while because I'm still researching this, but I'm creating a tool. It's going to basically hack into the internals of the way Git works and store parallel branches that's a before and after transformation with metadata to allow you to create a set of isomorphic transformation rules on your JavaScript. So you can write your version of JavaScript, somebody else can write their version of JavaScript, and what gets committed in is the agreed upon standard JavaScript, so it runs in browsers. And when you get your view of the code, it's the way you want, and when they get their view of the code, it's the way they want. This is possible. It's hard. But tools like this can be built, and we can get away from these local maximums. We just need better tools. Real quickly, let me give you some examples. By the way, the tools that I'm about to show you, this is a small link, but go and watch this talk from Arya Hidyat. It's a great talk. It talks about tools. But let me just show you a couple that are out there, tools that we can use. Esprima and Acorn are parsers, so you can parse JavaScript. They're written in JavaScript, so you can run them inside a node and stuff. ESCodeGen takes an AST that's been parsed and it turns it back into code. ESScope and ESLevels do scope analysis on your code. So it can actually figure out where all your nested scopes are. Istanbul looks at code coverage. ESTraverse analyzes your AST. It can figure out where all your variables have been declared and any that are unused. ESLint from Nicholas Akis is pluggable code linting rules, so you can write your own sorts of linting rules. And finally, Plato and JS Complexity go and study and analyze the complexity of your code and can actually be used to figure out if your code is overly complex. So what are some things, lastly, that we could do to fix this? Well, we could autocorrect misspellings. We could safely rearrange our scope. if we're writing our scope nested in an unoptimized way. We could consolidate our declarations, automatically reduce our complexity, refactor Boolean traps, and optimize our performance, and even more. These are all things that we could do if we had better tools. Instead of focusing so much on standards, I think we should focus on better tools. So what this all boils down to is, start asking the question, where's your straw? Why isn't your process and tools optimized to the way that you want to work? Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate you listening.